Lexie Hull might not have meant to say anything controversial, but what she just revealed could quietly explain everything that's happening inside the Indiana Fever right now. Because while most people are focused on Caitlin Clark, the sold-out arenas, the national headlines, the viral moments, something much more important is happening behind the scenes. And it's coming from the players who were there before any of this hype even existed. And that's where this gets interesting. Because Lexie Hull isn't just another teammate reacting to the moment. She's someone who lived through the version of Indiana that nobody talks about anymore. The version with empty seats, losing seasons, and almost no attention at all. So when she sits down and casually talks about wanting to stay, about loving the environment, about how different everything feels now, that's not just a feel-good quote. That's a signal. A signal that something inside this team has shifted in a way that fans are only just starting to understand. And if you really listen to what she said, and more importantly, how she said it, it raises a much bigger question than anyone expected. Is Indiana building something real around Caitlin Clark? Or are they about to face the kind of pressure that tears rising teams apart? Because what Lexie revealed might be the clearest sign, yet that the Fever are standing at a turning point. And what happens next could define this team for years. But to really understand why her words matter, you have to look at what they actually revealed. The moment itself didn't feel dramatic. There was no big announcement. No headline quote that immediately blew up across social media. No bold statement that screamed controversy. It was just a conversation. Relaxed. Casual. Almost too normal to catch attention at first. But that's exactly why it matters. Because sometimes the most important things aren't said loudly. They're said comfortably. And that's exactly what happened when Lexie Hull sat down and started talking about Indiana. She wasn't trying to sell anything. She wasn't trying to create a narrative. She wasn't speaking like someone calculating every word for the media. She sounded honest. And when players get honest, that's when you start to see what's really going on behind the scenes. She talked about how much things have grown, how different the experience feels now compared to when she first entered the league, how the energy around the team has completely changed. But more importantly, she kept coming back to one idea without forcing it. She wants to be there. Not in a vague, generic way. Not in the usual, I love my team type of answer athletes give when they're trying to stay safe. There was something deeper in how she described it. She talked about enjoying coming to the gym, about loving the people around her, about feeling grateful for where she is right now. And that word grateful says more than people realize. Because players don't use that word lightly when they're thinking about their future. Especially not in a league where contracts, roles, and opportunities can change fast. And here's where it gets even more interesting. Lexie Hull is heading into a situation where she has options. She's not locked into one path. She's not forced to stay. Other teams can come in with offers. Other opportunities can open up. So when someone in that position talks about wanting to stay where they are, that's not random. That's a decision forming in real time. And if you listen closely, you can hear something else underneath it. Comfort. Not the kind of comfort that makes players stagnant, but the kind that comes from being in the right system, around the right people, at the right moment in your career. She understands her role. She fits into the identity of the team. She knows how she contributes, even if she's not always the headline name. And in today's game, that kind of clarity is rare. Because a lot of players in her position would be looking at this moment differently. They'd be thinking about maximizing value, expanding roles, testing the market, seeing what else is out there. But Lexie's perspective feels different. It feels like someone who sees what this team is becoming and doesn't want to lose her place in it. And that's where the real meaning starts to take shape. Because when a role player, someone who does the hard, less glamorous work, wants to stay in a system, that usually means the system is working. It means the culture is real. It means the chemistry isn't forced. And most importantly, it means players believe something bigger is being built. But here's the part that people might be overlooking. That belief didn't come out of nowhere. It wasn't always like this. In fact, not long ago, Indiana looked like a completely different franchise. And that contrast is what makes everything Lexie said hit even harder. Because once you understand what she experienced before all of this, you start to realize just how dramatic this shift really is, and why her words might carry more weight than anyone expected. Because what changed in Indiana wasn't small. It was everything. Lexie didn't have to say it directly, but you could hear it between the lines. Because when she talked about how much things have changed, she wasn't exaggerating. She was comparing two completely different worlds. And unless you were paying attention back then, it's hard to fully understand just how drastic that shift really is. This wasn't a team that was just building. This was a team that was invisible. We're talking about games where the energy inside the arena felt flat before tip-off even happened. Nights where you could literally see empty sections stretching across the stands. A few thousand fans scattered around, trying to create noise in a space that was never full enough to carry it. And for the players on the court, that kind of environment does something to you. It tests you. Because it's one thing to perform when the lights are bright, when the crowd is loud, when the stakes feel real. But it's something completely different when you're putting in the same effort, and barely anyone is watching. That was Indiana. That was the version Lexie Hull walked into at the start of her career. A team that was still trying to figure itself out. A roster filled with talent, but without momentum. A franchise that wasn't being talked about on a national level. And most importantly, a team that wasn't winning enough to demand attention. She mentioned it casually, almost like it was just part of the journey. Winning only a handful of games in a season. Think about that for a second. That kind of record doesn't just affect standings, it affects identity. Because when a team struggles like that, everything becomes harder. Confidence drops. Media attention disappears. Fan engagement fades. And even internally, it becomes difficult to maintain belief when the results aren't matching the effort. But here's what makes Lexie's perspective different. She didn't run from that version of Indiana. She stayed through it. She experienced the frustration, the slow rebuild, the feeling of showing up every day knowing the outside world wasn't expecting much from your team. And that kind of experience does one of two things to players. It either pushes them away, or it attaches them to the process in a way that outsiders can't fully understand. And with Lexie, it's clear which direction she went. Because when she talks about Indiana now, there's a sense of appreciation that only comes from seeing both sides. She remembers what it felt like when people didn't recognize the team. She remembers when walking through an airport didn't mean anything. No fans stopping you. No cameras. No attention. Just another team moving quietly through the season. And now, that reality doesn't even exist anymore. Now when Indiana shows up, people notice. Now there's anticipation. Now there's energy before the game even starts. And that contrast, from almost unnoticed to impossible to ignore, is what makes this story so powerful. Because it didn't happen slowly. It didn't build over a decade. It flipped. Fast. Almost overnight. And that kind of sudden change doesn't just impact fans. It changes how players experience the game itself. Because suddenly, everything feels bigger. Every play matters more. Every mistake is more visible. Every moment carries weight. And for players like Lexie, who lived through the quiet version of this franchise, that shift isn't just exciting. It's overwhelming in the best way possible. You go from playing in front of a few thousand people to stepping into arenas where every seat is filled. You go from being overlooked to being part of one of the most talked about teams in the league. You go from developing in the background to performing under a spotlight that never turns off. And that's not just a change in numbers. That's a complete transformation of identity. But here's where things get even more interesting. Because that transformation didn't just happen randomly. It didn't come from a slow rebuild finally paying off. It didn't come from years of gradual improvement. It came from one moment, one arrival, one player stepping into the league and instantly shifting the gravity of everything around her. And once that happened, Indiana wasn't the same team anymore. The expectations changed. The attention exploded. And the pressure? It went to a completely different level. Because when everything flips that fast, it forces everyone involved to adjust just as quickly. And that's exactly what happened next. Because what came with that attention wasn't just excitement. It was something much bigger than anyone anticipated. The shift didn't feel gradual. It wasn't one of those slow rebuild stories where a team quietly improves year after year until people finally start paying attention. No, this was different. This was the kind of change you feel immediately. The kind that hits so fast, even the players inside it have to take a second to process what's happening around them. Because the moment Caitlin Clark stepped into Indiana, everything changed. And not just a little. Completely. The arenas didn't just get louder, they filled up. Every seat. Every night. Home games suddenly became events. Not just games, events. And it didn't stop there. Even on the road, when Indiana showed up, It wasn't just another matchup on the schedule anymore. It became the game. Teams started moving venues, expanding capacity, preparing for crowds they hadn't seen in years. Fans weren't just showing up to support their own teams. They were showing up to see Caitlin. And when that happens, something interesting starts to take place. Because attention doesn't just stay locked on one player. It spreads. It expands. It pulls everyone around that player into the spotlight. And that's exactly what happened to Lexie Hall. Because before this, she was doing the same things she's doing now. Playing hard, defending, running the floor, doing the small things that don't always show up in highlight clips but win games. The difference? Back then, most people didn't see it. Now, everyone does. Now fans are noticing the hustle plays. Now analysts are talking about her role. Now jerseys with her number are showing up in the crowd. And that right there is the real effect. It's not just about Caitlin Clark putting up numbers or hitting deep shots. It's about how her presence elevates the visibility of everyone around her. And for a player like Lexie, that changes everything. Because in sports, recognition isn't just about talent. It's about timing. It's about environment. It's about being in a situation where what you do actually gets seen, appreciated, and understood. And suddenly, Lexie is in that exact situation. But here's where it gets even more complex. Because with that visibility comes expectation. And expectation changes the way everything feels. Now, when you step on the court, it's not just about playing your role. It's about performing in front of thousands of people who are watching every movement, every defensive stop, every missed rotation, every small mistake that might have gone unnoticed before. Now gets seen, analyzed, talked about. And for some players, that kind of pressure can break them. It can make them hesitate. It can take away the natural flow of their game. But Lexie, she leaned into it. She didn't try to become something she's not. She didn't chase headlines. She stayed in her lane, and somehow that made her even more valuable. Because when you have a star like Caitlin Clark commanding attention, you need players who can stabilize everything around that energy. Players who don't get distracted. Players who don't overcomplicate their role. Players who understand that winning isn't always about being the loudest name. Sometimes it's about being the most reliable one. And that's exactly where Lexie fits. She became one of those players you don't fully appreciate until you watch closely. The kind of player coaches trust. The kind of player teammates rely on. The kind of player fans start to respect more and more the longer they watch. And that's why her voice matters right now. Because she's not speaking from hype. She's speaking from experience inside the shift. She felt what it was like before. She's living what it feels like now. And she understands something that most people outside the team don't. This kind of rapid rise comes with a cost. Because when a team goes from overlooked to center stage, it doesn't just create opportunity. It creates pressure, expectations, and decisions that have to be made fast. And that's where the story starts to turn. Because while fans are enjoying the rise, and while players are embracing the moment, there's another layer building underneath everything. A layer that isn't as visible. A layer that doesn't show up in highlights or crowd reactions. But it's there. And it's growing. Because when a team rises this quickly, the question is no longer, can they get attention? It becomes something much more serious. Can they handle what comes with it? And more importantly, can they keep it together before that pressure starts pulling things apart? Because what looks like momentum on the outside sometimes feels very different on the inside. And that's exactly where things start to get complicated. Here's the part that doesn't get talked about enough. Not every player benefits from playing next to a superstar. In fact, a lot of players struggle with it. Because when someone like Caitlin Clark steps into the spotlight, everything shifts toward her. The offense runs through her. The cameras follow her. The headlines are built around her. And for some players, that can feel like they're being pushed into the background. Less touches, less recognition, less opportunity to stand out. That's the reality of star-driven teams. But Lexie Hall, she didn't disappear in that environment. She adapted to it. And somehow, that made her even more valuable. Because what Indiana needed wasn't just more scoring or more flash. They needed balance. They needed someone willing to do the things that don't always show up in highlight reels. The hustle plays, the defensive stops, the moments where you sacrifice your body, your stats, your spotlight, just to keep the team functioning. And those are the exact areas where Lexie started to stand out. Not loudly, not dramatically, but consistently. Every game, you could see it. She's diving for loose balls when others hesitate. She's taking charges when most players step aside. She's sprinting back on defense even when the play looks over. And those little moments, they add up. Because when you're playing next to a high-powered offensive engine like Caitlin Clark, those small things become the difference between winning and losing. They become the glue. And that's exactly what Lexie turned into. The glue that holds everything together when the game starts to speed up. The player who doesn't need the ball to impact the game. The one who fills in the gaps that stars don't always cover. And here's where it gets even more interesting. Fans are starting to notice it. At first, it was subtle. A few mentions. A few clips. People pointing out the effort plays. But over time, it grew. Now you're seeing her jersey in the crowd. Now you're hearing analysts bring her name up when talking about Indiana's success. Now fans aren't just watching Caitlin. They're watching how players like Lexie make everything around Caitlin actually work. And that kind of recognition changes everything for a player. Because once fans understand your value, your importance becomes harder to replace. And that's where the situation starts to get complicated. Because Lexie isn't just another role player anymore. She's becoming part of the identity of this team. And identity is dangerous to mess with. Because teams don't just win because of talent. They win because of chemistry. Because players understand each other. Because roles are clear. Because there's trust built over time that you can't just recreate overnight. And Lexie is right in the middle of that. She knows how Caitlin plays. She understands the pace. She fits into the system without forcing anything. She complements instead of competing. And that's rare. Because a lot of teams try to build around stars, but they struggle to find the right pieces that actually fit. Indiana? They might already have one of those pieces. And the more this team grows, the more obvious that becomes. But here's the part that starts to raise questions. Because once a player reaches that level of importance, they also reach a different level of value. Not just to their current team, but to everyone else watching. Because other teams see it too. They see the hustle. They see the chemistry. They see how well she fits next to a superstar. And they start thinking, what if she did that for us? And that's when things start to shift. Because now it's no longer just about how much Lexie wants to stay. It becomes about who else wants her, and what they're willing to offer. Because in professional sports, appreciation doesn't always stay internal. Once the rest of the league notices you, opportunities follow, offers follow, decisions follow. And suddenly, what felt stable doesn't feel so simple anymore. Because keeping a player like Lexie isn't just about wanting her on the team. It's about being able to keep her when the entire market starts paying attention. And that's exactly where Indiana is heading. Because while everything on the court looks like it's coming together, off the court, the situation is starting to get a lot more complicated. And what happens next might not just affect Lexie. It could affect the entire direction of this team. This is where everything starts to get real. Because up to this point, the story feels exciting. A young team rising. A superstar changing everything. Role players stepping into bigger moments. Chemistry building at the perfect time. It all sounds like the beginning of something special. And it is. But what most fans don't realize is this. Moments like this don't stay simple for long. Because the second a team becomes valuable, everyone inside it becomes valuable too. And that's when the business side of the game starts creeping in. Slowly at first. Then all at once. Because right now, Indiana isn't just dealing with momentum. They're dealing with decisions. Big ones. The kind that can either lock in a team's future or quietly break it apart before it ever reaches its full potential. And it starts with one simple reality. They can't keep everyone, no matter how good the chemistry feels, no matter how much players want to stay, no matter how exciting the future looks. At some point, money gets involved. And when money gets involved, everything changes. Because suddenly, it's not just about fit anymore. It's about value. It's about contracts. It's about timing. And most importantly, it's about choices. Let's start with Lexie. She's not just a player who wants to stay. She's a player entering a situation where other teams can step in. And that's where things get dangerous. Because when a player like her becomes visible, other teams don't see a role player. They see opportunity. They see someone who can bring energy, defense, and reliability into their own system. They see someone who already proved she can thrive next to a superstar, which makes her even more appealing. And when multiple teams start seeing that value, the price goes up. Fast. Now Indiana has a decision to make. Do they match whatever offers come in? Or do they risk losing a piece that's become part of their identity? And that's just one layer. Because this isn't only about Lexie. Now you bring Sophie Cunningham into the picture. And her situation is even more unpredictable. Because unlike Lexie, Sophie has full control. She can go wherever she wants. No restrictions. No matching rights. No safety net for Indiana. If she decides to walk, she's gone. And that adds another level of pressure. Because Sophie isn't just another name on the roster. She's part of the personality of this team. The energy, the attitude, the edge. The kind of presence that doesn't always show up in stats. But you feel it when it's missing. So now you have two key pieces. Both sitting in situations where their future isn't guaranteed. And then there's one more name that makes this even more complicated. Kelsey Mitchell. Because her situation brings in a completely different type of tension. This isn't just about keeping a role player or an energy piece. This is about keeping a proven scorer. A player who commands real money. The kind of money that forces front offices to think carefully. Because once you start handing out big contracts, flexibility disappears, options shrink, and suddenly, every decision becomes connected. If you pay one player, it affects what you can offer another. If you prioritize one role, you might have to sacrifice another. And this is where things get uncomfortable. Because now the Fever aren't just building a team, they're balancing it. And balancing is where teams make mistakes. Because it's easy to say, keep the core together. Fans love that idea. It feels right. It sounds simple. But in reality, it's one of the hardest things to do in professional sports. Because keeping a core isn't just about desire. It's about alignment, timing, money, and sometimes, sacrifice. And here's the part that nobody likes to talk about. Sometimes keeping everyone together actually holds a team back. Because growth comes with change. Because sometimes new pieces bring new energy. Because sometimes tough decisions are what push a team to the next level. But there's also the other side. Sometimes, breaking apart a group too early destroys something that was just starting to work. And that's the risk Indiana is facing right now. Because what they have isn't just talent. It's chemistry. It's momentum. It's identity. And those things don't come around often. You can't just rebuild them overnight. You can't just replace them with new names. You either protect them, or you lose them. And once they're gone, you don't always get them back. So now the question isn't just about contracts. It's about direction. Do you lock in what's already working? Or do you gamble on something bigger? Do you trust the chemistry? Or do you chase potential upgrades? Do you build patiently? Or do you accelerate while the spotlight is hot? Because make no mistake, the spotlight is hot right now. And that creates pressure. Pressure to act. Pressure to decide. Pressure to not waste the moment. And that pressure is only getting stronger. Because there's one more factor that makes this situation even more urgent. One that changes the timeline completely. One that forces Indiana to think faster than they probably wanted to. Because the moment that factor came back into the picture, everything sped up. And now, there's no more time to wait. Because what's coming next might be the biggest turning point of all. Up to this point, Indiana had something most rising teams rely on. Time. Time to build chemistry. Time to figure things out. Time to develop players without pressure crushing every decision. Even with all the attention, there was still this feeling that the Fever were early in the process. That they could grow into something bigger. That mistakes were part of the journey. But that timeline, it just changed. Because Caitlin Clark is coming back. And that one fact alone speeds everything up. Because when a player like Caitlin is on the floor, you're no longer just building. You're expected to win. Immediately. And that expectation doesn't come quietly. It shows up everywhere. In the media. In the fan base. Inside the organization. Suddenly, patience disappears. Because once you have a superstar fully active, every season becomes an opportunity you can't afford to waste. And that's exactly where Indiana is right now. Because Caitlin isn't just any player returning from time away. She's the engine of everything this team has become. The reason arenas are packed. The reason expectations exploded. The reason the Fever are no longer ignored. So when she steps back onto the court, everything resets. But not in a calm way. In a pressure-filled way. Because now, every decision gets judged through a different lens. It's no longer, are we developing correctly? It becomes, are we maximizing this moment? And that shift, it's massive. Because maximizing a moment requires action. It requires clarity. It requires commitment. And most importantly, it requires choosing a direction fast. Because the worst thing a team can do in this situation is hesitate. You can't half-build and half-contend at the same time. You can't stay in development mode while also trying to compete with the best teams in the league. At some point, you have to decide. And Caitlyn's return forces that decision sooner than expected. Because think about it from Indiana's perspective. You now have a generational-level player back in the lineup, a fan base that's fully locked in, a spotlight that's not going anywhere, momentum that's already built, and a roster that's close, but not guaranteed to stay intact. That's not a normal situation. That's a window. And windows like that don't stay open forever. Because in professional sports, timing is everything. You can have talent. You can have chemistry. You can have potential. But if the timing isn't right, it doesn't matter. And right now, Indiana's timing is lining up in a way that feels almost too perfect, which is exactly why it's dangerous. Because when everything lines up like this, the pressure to get it right becomes overwhelming. And this is where the tension really starts to build. Because now every move has consequences. If you keep the current core, you're betting that chemistry plus Caitlyn's return is enough to take the next step. If you make changes, you're betting that upgrades will push you further faster. But here's the problem. You don't get to test both paths. You have to choose one. And once you choose, you live with it. Because if you break the chemistry and it doesn't work, you don't get those players back. If you keep everything the same and fall short, people will say you didn't do enough. There's no safe option anymore. That's what Caitlyn's return creates. Clarity, but also pressure. And for players like Lexie, this changes everything too. Because now it's not just about where she wants to be. It's about whether Indiana sees her as part of a winning version of this team. Not just a growing one, a winning one. And that difference, it decides contracts. It decides roles. It decides futures. Because when a team shifts from development to expectation, some players rise with it, and some players get replaced. That's the harsh reality of it. And everyone inside that locker room knows it, even if they don't say it out loud. Which is why Lexie's comments feel even more important now. Because she's not just talking about the present. She's talking about where she sees herself when everything speeds up, when the stakes get higher, when the pressure increases. And that's what makes this moment so critical. Because Indiana isn't just preparing for another season. They're preparing for a different level of expectation entirely. And that's where the biggest question starts to form. Not about talent, not about hype, but about decisions. Because now that the timeline has changed, and now that the pressure is real, the Fever have to decide what kind of team they actually want to be. And that decision? It's not as simple as it sounds. Because there's one mistake teams make over and over again in this exact situation. A mistake that feels smart in the moment, but ends up costing them everything they just built. And if Indiana isn't careful, they could be heading straight toward it. This is the moment where everything starts to split. Because on the surface, the decision feels obvious. You have a rising team. You have a superstar returning. You have momentum. So what do most teams do in this situation? They go all in. They look at what they have, and they try to upgrade it. Add more talent. Chase bigger names. Make moves that look powerful on paper. And at first, it makes sense. Because the logic is simple. If you're already good, why not become even better? But here's the problem. That mindset has ruined more rising teams than people realize. Because what looks like an upgrade often destroys the thing that made the team work in the first place. And that thing is usually chemistry, the invisible part of the game. The part fans don't always see, but players feel every single day. Because chemistry isn't just about liking each other. It's about understanding, knowing where someone will be without thinking, trusting that your teammate will make the right play, feeling comfortable in your role without second-guessing everything. And Indiana? They're starting to build that. You can see it, not just in wins or highlights, but in how the team moves, how players react to each other, how everything feels connected instead of forced. And Lexie Hull is a huge part of that connection. She fits, not because she's the biggest name, but because she understands how everything flows around Caitlyn. She doesn't slow it down. She doesn't fight for control. She complements it. And that kind of fit is rare. But here's where the danger comes in. Because when a team gets attention like Indiana has, the outside noise gets louder. Suddenly, It's not just about what's happening inside the locker room. It's about what people think should happen. Fans start suggesting moves. Analysts start proposing trades. Media starts asking questions like, should they add another star? Should they upgrade this position? Are they doing enough to compete right now? And little by little, that noise starts to influence decisions. Because no team wants to feel like they're missing an opportunity. No front office wants to be accused of not being aggressive enough. So what happens? They start looking for changes, even when things are working. And that's where teams make their biggest mistake. They fix what isn't broken. They chase potential instead of protecting reality. They assume more talent automatically equals better results. But it doesn't, because basketball isn't just about stacking talent. It's about how that talent fits together. And once you break that fit, it's incredibly hard to rebuild. Because new players don't come with instant chemistry. They come with adjustment periods, with learning curves, with moments where things don't click right away. And in a situation like Indiana's, that adjustment period could cost them everything. Because remember, the timeline has already changed. Caitlin is back. The pressure is on. There's no room for long experiments anymore. So now the Fever are stuck in a difficult position. Do they trust what they've built? Or do they risk it for something bigger? Do they keep players like Lexie, who already fit perfectly? Or do they gamble on someone who might be more talented on paper but less connected to the system? And this is where things get uncomfortable. Because sometimes the smartest move is the one that looks the least exciting. Keeping your core, trusting your chemistry, believing in the players who helped build the momentum in the first place. But that doesn't always satisfy the outside world. Because fans love big moves. They love headlines. They love the idea of assembling something unstoppable, even if it means sacrificing the balance that made the team work. And if Indiana listens too much to that noise, they could walk straight into the same trap other teams have fallen into before. A trap where you gain more names, but lose your identity. And once identity is gone, everything becomes harder. Roles get unclear. Trust weakens. Consistency disappears. And suddenly, a team that looked like it was rising starts slipping. Not because they lacked talent, but because they lost what made them function. And that's why this moment matters so much. Because Indiana is right on that edge. Right between stability and change. Right between trusting what they have and chasing what they don't. And the decision they make, it won't just affect next season. It will shape how this team is seen for years. Because if they get it right, they could turn this momentum into something lasting. Something real. But if they get it wrong, this entire rise could end up being shorter than anyone expected. And that brings everything back to one final question. A question that doesn't just involve contracts or talent, but something deeper. Something that Lexie Hull might have already answered, without even realizing it. At first, it sounded simple. Just a player talking about her experience. About growth. About enjoying where she is. About wanting to stay. Nothing dramatic. Nothing controversial. But when you step back and look at everything happening around that moment, it starts to feel different. Because Lexie Hull didn't just talk about Indiana. She revealed how she sees it. And that perspective might be more important than anything else in this entire situation. Because when a player who has seen both sides of a franchise, the struggles and the rise, chooses to stay, that tells you something real is being built. Not hype, not just attention, something real. She's not reacting to headlines. She's not chasing popularity. She's not speaking like someone caught up in the moment. She's speaking like someone who understands the difference between what's temporary and what could last. And that's what makes this so important. Because Indiana right now is sitting in that exact space. Between moment and movement. On one side, you have everything that feels explosive. Caitlin Clark. The crowds. The attention. The national spotlight. The energy that makes every game feel bigger than it used to. That's the moment. But on the other side, you have something quieter. Something harder to see. Something that takes time to recognize. The relationships between players. The trust that's forming. The roles that are starting to make sense. The identity that's slowly becoming clear. That's the movement. And here's the truth most people don't realize. Moments are easy to create. Movements are hard to sustain. Because moments rely on excitement. But movements rely on stability. And stability comes from decisions. From who you keep. From who you trust. From what you're willing to protect. And that's exactly where Indiana is right now. At a point where they have to decide. What matters more? Do they protect the movement? Or chase another moment? Do they keep the players who understand the system? Or bring in new names that might raise expectations even higher? Do they trust the chemistry that's already forming? Or risk resetting everything for something that looks better? And that's where Lexie's words start to feel like more than just words. Because she's not just talking about enjoying the present. She's showing belief in the direction, belief in the people around her, belief in what this team is becoming. And belief like that isn't guaranteed, especially not in a league where players have options, where opportunities exist everywhere, where situations can change overnight. If something feels unstable, players don't talk like that. They hesitate. They stay neutral. They avoid commitment. But Lexie didn't do that. She leaned in. And that tells you everything. It tells you that inside that locker room, there's something forming that outsiders can't fully see yet. Something that goes beyond stats and highlights. Something that feels sustainable. But here's the part that makes this all so important. That kind of belief, it's fragile. It can grow into something powerful, or it can disappear just as quickly. And what decides that is what happens next. Because if Indiana makes the right decisions, if they protect the chemistry, if they keep the pieces that actually fit, this doesn't just become a good team. It becomes a problem for the entire league. A team with identity, with balance, with a superstar leading and the right pieces supporting. That's how long-term contenders are built. But if they get it wrong, if they chase too much, if they break apart what's already working, then everything Lexie felt, everything she believed in, everything that's starting to build right now, could disappear faster than it arrived. And that's what makes this offseason different. It's not just about contracts. It's not just about roster moves. It's about direction. Because Indiana is no longer trying to become relevant. They already are. Now they have to prove they can stay that way. And that's a completely different challenge. Because staying at the top is always harder than getting there. And maybe, just maybe, Lexie Hull already understands that better than anyone. So now the real question isn't just about Lexie Hull. It's about Indiana. Do they keep the core that helped create this rise? Or do they risk it all trying to build something even bigger? Because one thing is clear. The Caitlin Clark era has already changed everything. But what happens next? We'll decide if this is just the beginning of something special, or the moment it all started to slip. If you want more real stories like this, breaking down Caitlin Clark, the Indiana Fever, and the moves that could reshape the entire league, make sure you hit subscribe. Because this offseason, it's just getting started.